nation divided by war, the Civil War. Now the Civil War was an unusual thing. You have a war within the United States of America. Okay? It's really a strange situation. And so our first subtopic on a nation divided by war is going to be choosing sides in the Civil War. Choosing sides in the Civil War. Now, Elizabeth, we talked a lot about issues, crisis and compromise, and the efforts that were made to try to keep us from going to civil war, but finally it just overcame us and we ended up there. So we'll go from there. Okay, choosing sides in the Civil War. Now, when the state of Virginia left the Union on April 17th, 1861, the United States Army lost several of its best officers because there were Southerners who then obviously went to the South. So again, when the state of Virginia seceded from the Union on April 17, 1861, the United States Army lost several of its best officers. I would say historically that the best military leaders of the United States Army prior to the Civil War were from the South. And so what they did during secession and during the start of the war is they left the Union and went and fought on the Confederate side. Huge disadvantage, which we'll talk about later for the Union. Now obviously the most famous Virginia officer to take up arms for the South was Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee. He was by far the most famous of all the Virginia officers to take arms for the South. You've all heard of Robert E. Lee, I assume. General, but he wasn't always a general. We'll get to that. Remember, he was the one that put down who at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Robert E. Lee was a colonel. Who did he put down? Who tried to take over Harper's Ferry? John Brown. And he was the man that served the Union Army that put down that uprising by John Brown at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Well, after the Confederate attack upon Fort Sumter, which led to civil war, Robert E. Lee was still a colonel in the Union Army. He was still a colonel in the Union Army. Nothing had changed. Well, remember, Virginia left the Union after Fort Sumter, right? So prior to Fort Sumter, even though Virginia was leaning towards seceding from the Union, Lee still remained loyal to the Union because they hadn't left yet. And General Winfield Scott, who was the overall commander of the United States Army, sent a message to Colonel Robert E. Lee and asked him to come visit him at Scott's home. Now let me go back so you understand this. Prior to Virginia seceding from the Union, Robert E. Lee was a colonel in the United States Army. And prior to Virginia seceding from the Union, General Winfield Scott, who was the overall commander of Union military forces, sent a message to Colonel Robert E. Lee, and he asked him to come visit him at General Scott's home. Lee and Scott were good friends because Lee, remember, fought under Scott's command. Where was Winfield Scott famous for? What general? What war did he fight in? From the halls of Montezuma. Yeah, but what war was that in? Mexican War. So Winfield Scott had worked his way up to be the overall commander of Union forces by this time. And he and Robert E. Lee were good friends because Lee fought under Scott's command in the Mexican War. And so Lee arrives at Scott's home and they begin to visit about this possible civil war that's coming in America. Okay? They could kind of see it coming. And when Colonel Lee arrived at Scott's home, they sat down and visited, and General Scott offered Colonel Robert E. Lee 2 things. What did he offer him? We want to guess? Now, Brady, you referred to him as, not
Position?
Colonel Lee. Yeah, first thing he offered Robert E. Lee was a promotion from colonel to general. That's quite a kick. Usually it doesn't go from colonel to general. But he offered him a promotion in rank from his present rank of colonel to that of general in the United States Army. Not because we haven't had a secession yet from Virginia. And what else did he offer him that he was holding at the time? What did General Scott offer Colonel Lee that it was his position at the time? Overall command. So he said, hey, here's what I'd like to offer you, Colonel Lee, a rank promotion from colonel to general. And I am willing to give you overall command of all Union forces for this upcoming Civil War. Now, who was really making the offer, although it was coming out of the mouth of General Winfield Scott? President Lincoln. Absolutely. So although General Scott was actually making the offer to Colonel Lee, it was officially coming directly from the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Why did Lee not accept or decline right away? What was he waiting to see? If Virginia would secede from the Union. As soon as Virginia seceded from the Union, Robert E. Lee resigned his position in the United States Army after serving for 30 years. Yep. So when Virginia seceded from the Union, Colonel Lee resigned from the United States Army. That happened on April 20th of 1861 after he had served 30 years. Yep, he served 30 years in the Union Army. But because his home state had seceded from the Union, he was loyal to his home state, resigned his command after 30 years in the United States Army. Well, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who we talked about before when we talked about him establishing that temporary government in Montgomery, Alabama, what did Confederate President Jefferson Davis do as soon as Virginia seceded? No, he's a Confederate president. What did he do? Did the same thing Winfield Scott did. Offered him a rank of general and to be overall commander of Confederate forces, which he accepted.
So he offered.
And who was that again?
Okay, Confederate President Jefferson Davis quickly promoted Robert E. Lee to the rank of general, and he gave him overall command of Confederate forces. What a swing of events over one state seceding from the Union. Well, word got back to General Winfield Scott about what Lee had been offered and accepted from Confederate President Jefferson Davis. What was his reaction? Anybody want to guess? What? Say it. Yeah, actually you'd think he'd be mad. You know what he said? He simply sighed and said, "The United States lost the very best officer in the service." He wasn't mad so much as he was horribly disappointed, and made it a compliment to Lee, saying, "The United States lost the very best officer in the service." He knew that he had lost the best man he could have had in this situation. So again, Confederate President Jefferson Davis quickly promotes Robert E. Lee to the rank of general and gives him overall command of Confederate forces in the Civil War. And when this bad news reached General Winfield Scott, he was so disappointed and upset that he collapsed on his couch and said, "The United States lost the very best officer in the service." He wasn't mad, just horribly upset and disappointed, because they were good friends And he knew now what he might be up against, right, in fighting a commander with the talents of Robert E. Lee. Okay? Well, let's kind of maybe back up a little bit. Let's look at May 20th, 1861. On May 20th of 1861, anybody remember how many states were in the Confederacy at that time? From your maybe notes prior? No? May 20th, 1861, good guess, 11 states joined the Confederacy. And remember, there were 4 border states we talked about. Border states were what? Those were on the fence that hadn't committed. And those were Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. I don't know if you need to write that down because you must have it in your notes from when we talked before. So by May 20th, this kind of reminder, by May 20th of 1861, 11 states had joined the Confederacy, and 4 border states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, which had not committed either way.
Out of a total of how many so far?
11 states were in the Confederacy, and then there were 4 on the fence.
Yeah, like overall, how many states were there at that time?
Oh, I'm not sure to tell you the truth. Now, what was the most crucial border state for the Union? The one that they absolutely wanted to, well, they'd have taken them on their side, but they certainly wanted them to stay at least neutral. That's not one of the 4, dear. Which one of the border states was most important to the Union that it stayed neutral? Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri.
Wasn't it Delaware?
No?
It's Missouri.
Why would it be Maryland? Hey, now, he's right. Listen, now listen. It was crucial that the border state of Maryland stay neutral. Why? How close is that? What's separating the Confederate state of Richmond and the Union state of Union capital of Washington, D.C.? Maryland. Okay? And so, now think about this. For the Union, it was crucial that the border state of Maryland stay neutral, because if it joined the Confederacy, the Union capital of Washington, D.C. would be cut off from the northern states, because it's between. You see what I'm saying? Okay. Now, there were a lot of Confederate sympathizers in Maryland. In other words, people that lived in Maryland that sided with who? The Confederacy. So on April 19th of 1861, on April 19th of 1861, a mob of angry citizens attacked a Union regiment as it passed through Baltimore, Maryland. So picture that in your mind. On April 19th of 1861, there's a Union or Northern regiment, military troops, that are going through Baltimore, Maryland, which is supposed to be a neutral state. And a mob of angry citizens that are sympathetic to the Confederacy attack these military soldiers. Well, Maryland wasn't that thrilled with Union troops coming through their state because they're supposed to be neutral. So they burned the railroad bridges that connected Baltimore with Philadelphia. They didn't want their state to be a passing ground between North and South. So Maryland authorities did not want Union troops passing through Maryland anymore, so they burned the railroad bridges that connected Baltimore with Philadelphia. What did Lincoln do to those angry citizens and those Maryland authorities that burned the railroad bridges? He sent in federal troops and arrested all Confederate sympathizers they knew about in Maryland. Well, probably. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, now, let's just picture this again in your mind. There were many Confederate sympathizers in Maryland, and on April 19th of 1861, a mob of angry citizens attacked a Union regiment and passed through Baltimore, because they didn't want Union soldiers using their state as a passageway to the South. Okay? Now, even to prevent more passage of Union troops, Maryland authorities burned the railroad bridges that connected Baltimore with Philadelphia. Lincoln was so upset about that, he sent in federal troops to Maryland and arrested any Confederate sympathizer they could find, because he wanted to use that passageway. Sympathizers are SYMPATHIZERS. Okay, I'm going to answer your question here, Brady. Those other three border states, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, are going to decide in favor of the North, which also included California and Oregon. And so by 1863, after West Virginia joined the Union, 24 states were fighting on the Union side. There's your answer. So you had 11 on the Confederate side and 24 on the northern side. But that's after Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri went Union, and California and Oregon on the West Coast were already Union. But it's 24 to 11. Okay? Now, what's the significance of these border states as far as people that fought in the war? It happened in other states, but especially the border states. When people started making their moves, what were torn apart? Families. Some went to fight on the northern side and some left to fight on the southern side. So you're going to have families torn apart. Some of these border states and their inhabitants are going to enlist in the Confederacy. Some are going to enlist with the Union. And I'm going to show you a movie series later called The Blue and the Gray. It's a fictional story, but it might be the best video I've shown as far as the tearing of families apart and brother versus brother. I think you'll really like it. Now here's some ironic things for you. Mrs. Lincoln, the president's wife, 3 of her brothers fought and died for the South. This is an example of how families were torn apart. 3 of Mrs. Lincoln's brothers fought for the South and were killed defending the South in the Civil War. How about that? Anybody know that? You think Abraham Lincoln's wife's brothers would have been on what side? North. They fought on the South and lost their lives. Robert E. Lee's nephew commanded Union naval forces in Virginia, while his uncle was fighting Union forces within a mile of each other. Think about that. Robert E. Lee's nephew commanded Union naval forces in Virginia, while his uncle was fighting the Union Army within a mile of each other. That's how families fought against each other. I'm just giving you 2 high-profile families. Mrs. Lincoln's brothers fought in the South and died. Robert E. Lee's nephew fought for the Union in a battle that was where he and his uncle were just a mile apart in Virginia. Now, these divisions within families and the breakup of lifetime friendships were probably the most tragic thing about the war. Brother fighting brother, etc. Family fighting family. Families no longer associating with each other over the sides they chose during the Civil War. It was a divider. That's why we have the overall topic, a nation divided by war, rather than the Civil War. I don't think the Civil War impacts a nation divided. All right, what's so funny?
Earlier I was like, it's okay, I never like my cousins anyway.
Oh.
And Branson just barely got the joke because he's one of my cousins.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Oh boy. Okay, now, Elizabeth, how you doing back there? Am I talking too fast?
No, I'm great.
I can't even see you. I'm going to have you and Haley switch desks tomorrow because I can't see you. And you don't mind being back one, will you, Haley? Okay, I want to make sure Elizabeth's catching on here because she's new. Okay, our next subtopic, which I think you'll find kind of interesting, is northern advantages versus southern advantages. What advantages did each of these sides have? Northern advantages versus southern advantages. Okay, we're going to talk about northern advantages, and we're going to talk about 3 specific advantages that the North had over the South, and give you examples of each. Okay? So northern advantages versus southern advantages. We're going to start with northern advantages, and we're going to tell you about 3 specific advantages the North had over the South and examples of each. Yes, my dear? Well, you're close, which would result in more what? Population. Very good. Number 1 advantage, population. And I'll give you some examples. The number 1 advantage that the North had over the South, population. Here's an example. The North's population at the outbreak of Civil War was 22 million people. The North's population was 22 million people. The South's population was 9 million people. 22 million to 9. Does that seem very balanced? It gets worse. Because of those 9 million people living in the South, 3.5 million of those were, no, slaves. Are slaves going to fight for the South? No. So if you look at the population, it's 22 million to about 5.5 million. Because 3.5 million of the 9 million that lived in the South were slaves who obviously aren't going to fight for the South. Okay? Not for the South. They'll fight for the North. Okay? So what's our next advantage besides population? What would be another advantage the North might have?
The railroads.
Railroads. We'll call it transportation is the next advantage. Transportation. This is not just railroads, and we'll explain that in a minute. The example of transportation is more than 70% of the railroad lines that were in the United States at the outbreak of Civil War were in the North. Okay, we would consider the northern side of the war. 70% of the